Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today, our guest is Daniëlle Keeven. She's the VP of Finance at Paddle, a payments, tax, and subscription solution for SaaS companies. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. Very excited to be here.
Cool. Very excited to have you. We chatted for a little bit. I think the energy is going to be high on this one. Super excited. So before we get going, do you mind just giving the quick 2-minute background on who you are, what your career has looked like, and kind of what you're doing at Paddle now?
Yes, I think we talked a little bit just before hopping on here. I'm Dutch-ish, I always say, because I was born there, raised in Aruba, studied in the US, and going back to the island, I really stepped into the hospitality space. But they would always give me the weird properties that were in trouble, audit cleanups, or people had walked out and things were chaotic. And so I learned to follow the money, which has proven to be quite helpful in the tech space. So when I switched over to the tech space, everybody's like, oh, you're so good at this. I was like, no, I just follow the money. And so that's a little bit of my background on how I switched to tech and just really help companies build out the backbone of operations to be able to capture the revenue and how it works and actually make money off of their product. And I was at booking.com for 4 years, switching over to MessageBird for almost about 2 years. And then Paddle came into the picture, and the energy of the company, the leadership through the process was just so contagious that I actually wasn't interested to move, but I just sold me on who they are as a company and their culture. So just totally loved it and fell in love with the company. And that's how I landed here.
Amazing. We mentioned this before. The background is so cool. You've been, around so many places, just the travel, moving around. I think the story is really cool. Follow the money is a nice tagline for this episode in general, because we're really going to focus on a lot of the mission critical work that it goes very underappreciated. It's not the sexy topic. It's just not. We're talking about billings and tax compliance, which on the surface is who wants to focus on this thing? But I know it's very important to you. I know it's very important to the work Paddle does. And without it, SaaS companies crumble. So before we get into things like best practices, tech solutions, and kind of how you approach these things, do you mind just talking a little bit about why tax compliance and subscription legislation should be more top of mind for SaaS leaders than maybe it is as the unsexy finance topic?
Yeah, I think the short sentence or the short answer to that is because game over. It's the one showstopper. I mean, next to your servers going down or your product, software not running. I think the other only external threat that is massive is if you're not compliant and you're building out your software, you're super excited about it, you have a great product, you put it out there, and then all of a sudden you get, the IRS or whoever knocking on your door, and it's just wait a minute, this is not what, this is not supposed to happen. So I think it's one of those things that does require an expert skill. So it's not one of those things that you can wing it. You can wing it probably out the gate, but not for very long if you're very successful. And so it's better to get your infrastructure in fast and early so that it can grow and scale with you as a company and you don't have to go to jail along the way. So that's probably the short version of why it's incredibly important.
That's a fantastic motivation for any finance leader. Don't land in jail because of your tech job. I love it. I think that's great. I want to talk about, I think when we were emailing about kind of potential topics for this, the message I got was that this is especially important when you're expanding internationally. And so I want to dig more into that because I guess from my perspective, I don't work in finance. I'm in marketing. And so, the benefit of running a SaaS company is that you can sell to anyone. That's the whole thing. You don't need a team to go to another country to implement some tool. But then you have something like this topic that's okay, this isn't as easy as just oh, we signed this company overseas and now we're good to go. So can you talk about some of the key compliance concerns, specifically about international SaaS sales, but even homegrown as well? What should people be thinking about as they put this at the top of the list?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because if you talk about the SaaS industry, it's so in the early stages for governments and taxes and legislation. And as a result, I think it's one of the more interesting waters to navigate, but also one of the more tricky. because often even governments want to do something with it, but they're not quite sure what or then how. And I think that really does present unwanted barriers and hurdles to go international. So I think the first thing to look at as well when you're going to expand to a country is whatever country you do expand, unless that customer is really large, I would actually look if your product actually fits the market before you go in, because it might actually be a requirement for you to register your company locally as an entity. And when you do that, it opens up a whole box of fun stuff. So you need to set up your bank accounts. You need to make sure you file your corporate taxes. You need to make sure you're compliant with your VAT and any other taxes on your software or SaaS, anything that's related to that. In addition to that, also, you need to hire your local accounting office or legal branches that need to advise you on what to do or what not to do. So I think it becomes very sexy when you're selling into another country. It becomes very tedious when you hit these roadblocks. And so I think there are obviously solutions out there that can mitigate some of these headaches, but that is something that you definitely should be thinking about. And I think something that is often overlooked that is actually more of a people HR
Mm.
hiring issue, in the sense of if you're actually going to hire someone on the ground, what does that mean for your company and your liability in that country? Because if that person is going to execute on your business contracts or make any decisions that the country can trace, then you're also liable to pay a certain amount of tax over the revenue that this person is bringing in or assumed to be responsible for your company. So there are quite a couple of hooks and needles to keep in mind.
It's a lot. I mean, honestly, it's like where to begin as far as follow-up questions. And so I think we're going to get into like a pretty tactical example later. I know you've gone through GDPR compliance, so we'll get into that in a little bit. But judging by like how much work you just kind of listed off, companies that we work with at Mosaic and, maybe Paddle's like grown out of this a little bit, but like a Series A startup, Series B startup, you have like one finance person. So
Exactly.
who is doing all of this work? Like, what is the time commitment? And yeah, like how do you get this done if there's so much to do and you're just selling to like a handful of customers
Yeah,
internationally?
I think you really nailed it. Basically, I think a lot of new SaaS companies usually have one person, and especially in tech companies, if they can keep the one person like hidden somewhere, like see no evil, hear no evil, like just make it run kind of thing. And I think it's interesting that you also mentioned it's an unappreciated job, but it's a massive responsibility to keep the wheels turning, and I think it's often underestimated. And I think there are solutions out there for sure that can help. Just like you can have like payment stacks, you have billing stacks, you have like tax pack, that you can purchase, or an end-to-end platform that can solve some of these friction points for you. But indeed, I think as a scaling company in the SaaS industry, it is very challenging, and it does require that one person to be very good at what they do. And also will probably require that person to collaborate with local authorities and local advisors to be able to cover some of these items that you need to make sure that they are in check as you grow.
It's crazy. Like you said, like we talked about already, underappreciated as somebody again, not in the finance job day in and day out. You take it for granted that you can just, expand that target market and you go and do an investor meeting or something. It's total addressable market. Like the whole world is our oyster. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, a little bit of a hurdle to get into that market. So, I mentioned GDPR. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Are there other like major pieces of legislation that people should keep in mind? I know you said we're in the early days, so maybe there aren't that many, but I'm curious if there are any others that come to mind.
Well, I think one of the other pieces that we as a company really keep an eye on as well as payment legislation changes. So there's like the tax, there's just the compliance that you have to do
Sure.
locally as well. But I think payment legislation is often overlooked. And that this is also can really impact your business. If you're particularly big in a specific market and they decide to change anything around that, they might like disrupt your subscription payments from coming in as effective immediately. So I think that's another thing that is often overlooked into the expansion and growth of the company.
Gotcha. Cool. So let's keep rolling. I know, I have some meatier topics. You mentioned a couple of things about the tech stack. We're going to get to that too. But I know I'd love to know, like, kind of, I don't know if it's a framework or like an approach. Like, if you're sitting down, you're like, I need to bring tax compliance to this company. I'm a new finance hire. Like, where do you start? Like, what is the process of actually putting that in place for the companies that we're talking about, these SaaS companies that are trying to scale and put this in place?
Yeah, I think especially in SaaS companies, by the time that a company realizes they need someone to do tax compliance, it's often almost too late. So you're going to get in at a nick of time. right?
Yeah.
It's not like somebody proactively thought, hey, we should probably do something with our taxes. It's like, oh, we probably got an assessment or we got like warning that we're going to get audited or something. And then that's
Yep.
when SaaS companies typically go out and find, a tax person. So I think as a tax person, which I am not, by the way, but I
Yeah.
do oversee some of these functions. When a tax person steps into a tech company, the first thing to do is assess where we are as a company. Like, are there any warnings? Are there any subpoenas? Are there any audits? Just going through like literally almost the shoebox of paperwork that you will find
Yep.
usually electronically and figuring out what the landscape
Hopefully.
looks like to kind of like pull into here and see where we're at. And then prioritize what is the first burning building. So I think usually a tax person, by the time they walk into any SaaS software company for the first 3 to 6 months, is doing nothing but putting out fires and actually keeping people out of jail. So, but that's basically where your starting point is. And I think as a tax person, then to also look forward to what the department should be like, how should we strategize, where should we roll out entities or roll back entities, because sometimes scale ups and startups are super excited and they open up entities all over the world, and then this tax person has to go like figure out where do we need to file, how we file, and so some of these entities you might actually not be using the contract for local business, so they actually
Yeah.
serve no purpose. Like, it might sound cool to be like, hey, we have an office, an entity in China and India, and but it also means like you're expanding the need for your compliance and what you need to do in order to stay in business. And you're also expanding your risk. So it may not make sense to have entities all over the world. And a really strong tax person can really give that advice to say, well, we should probably close this entity and open another one in that country. Or we can triangulate some of the businesses or, and contract advice on how to best navigate those waters. So first 3 to 6 months, heads down in the weeds, figuring out where the company is at and what has or hasn't been done.
Man, it seems like that's like the MO for a lot more than just 6 months for early stage finance leaders. But hear you for sure. You mentioned that you are not the tax person, but you're clearly this whole process. So I'm curious, like, I don't know if you went through this a paddle, if you've gone through it in past companies, but have you been the sole like finance person who then had to bring on that tax person? Like, have you been in a position to decide what is that kind of like tipping point where we need to bring someone on? And maybe like, what were the pain points that was like, okay, like we're about at the precipice of being in trouble here. Like, we need to bring someone in.
So I've not done a startup yet. So I have done
Yeah.
mostly scale ups. And scale ups are
Yeah.
like right in the middle where they're realizing, hey, this one person can't hold it
Yes.
all together. However, next to that in the hospitality industry, I have been the person
Mm.
they bring in to fix all of it kind of thing. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think in that point, typically it is mostly a big warning from a
Mm.
government that is issued and formalized, typically through a
Yep.
lawyer, that the companies go like, oh, we probably need to get somebody. But typically, most companies do solicit external help. So they'll have local support of the tax advisors. But at some point, they realize, well, we probably need to bring that together and have somebody manage that relationship as well. Because a good tax person will make sure that you're compliant. However, they will also make sure that we have a local representative to represent your tax interests to make sure that nothing is overlooked. So it's kind of a collaboration of the two.
Love it. I have this set of questions here that I want to get into about GDPR compliance, but I think like as the most basic version of the question is that I know GDPR to be at least like the way kind of like mainstream news is pitched is like it's like a data privacy law. Does this have implications for tax, for billing, for things like this? Is this part of the process that we're talking about where we're like expanding sales and I guess, does it fit into this conversation?
GDPR is something that we all in the software space, I think in the SaaS industry, have to comply with. Like, even if you're not Europe based, if you have European customers, which if you're a
Yep.
global company or expanding your markets, you're likely to have or get later down the line. So I do think it has a piece to do with compliance.
Yep.
And so depending on how you store your customer information, it does become relevant to the compliance conversation. So I do think
Gotcha.
this is a big piece as well that can be challenging for the SaaS industry, because I think the first thing you'll do when you realize, oh, I'm in the European market, I have European customers, I need to be GDPR compliant, is you're likely to see if somebody else somewhere can start hitting delete buttons when they need to, when somebody's asked to be forgotten. And so the processes right out the gate tend to be manual, which are super
Mm.
prone to human error. So, GDPR has meant a lot of fun for a lot of companies when it rolled out, and definitely a scare for a lot of industries given the big fines that are implied if you're not compliant. So, yeah, no, definitely.
It's been what, like 7 years? I feel like I
It's
used
been that
to
long?
I thought it was I can't remember what
No,
year
you,
it
you
was, but it was like
right.
2015, 2016 maybe?
Yeah, you could.
I can't remember exactly, but I remember I worked at agencies for a long time, and there was this groundswell of need. There just everybody needed to write blog posts about GDPR compliance, and I feel like that was the time frame. But regardless, it wasn't like recent. So we're in. It's been some years since
Yeah.
this was around. Are you finding that it's still like a major pain point? You said like processes are still very manual. Like, are people still trying to navigate how to actually make GDPR compliance
Yeah, I
happen?
I think it's interesting because I think initially when the blog post came out, everybody would like start to read 5 minutes into it and then just be like, it's
It's
information
like,
overload. Like, and I think since then there's a better understanding and less
yeah,
panic. Also because I do think some of the execution around this, we were all terrified and then found out that, yeah, okay, we can do this. We got this. So I think in
yeah,
general, the businesses have become more relaxed or more confident, I would say, in their ability to comply. Right. So I
gotcha.
think I think the main thing is to try to kind of challenge yourself to test yourself. I always like say, like, especially when you're in a startup or a scale up, growing into those two phases, that stress testing your processes is super interesting to see. Well, if I 10x, if I 100x, am I able to sustain the GDPR compliance or any compliance for the matter, or even your software, your hardware? Can it
Yep.
sustain the growth? And I think that's something that you can also do for your GDPR processes to make sure that you're compliant. The best audit you can perform is auditing yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot better to do it yourself than to wait until somebody's coming in scrutinizing every little piece of your tech stack and your processes and your paper trail. So I hear that completely. Can we I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but can we walk through like tactically like how people should approach GDPR compliance? Like I know this is just one of many compliance conversations we could have. We could probably spend many hours on here trying to teach people how to comply with every little payment legislation and billing sort of process. But I think this is a big enough one where it'll have far enough reaching sort of implications. So, first off, like, did you do this for Paddle or had Paddle already been GDPR compliant?
The paddle was already GDPR compliant. They've been
Okay, lucky.
around before I joined. So
Yep,
no,
good,
these are the fundamentals that were correctly and are correctly in place here at Paddle. Also
nice.
being a fintech in the fintech space, you want to make sure
Yep,
you're compliant. I think that's
cool.
the big requirement to operate in a space.
Any Paddle customers out here listening, it's like they better be
They
compliant.
better
Like
be
hopes.
compliant. Yeah, no, no.
um,
The GDPR has been around for longer than I have at Paddle,
yeah,
so it's definitely woven into the foundations of the company.
cool.
And I think honestly, the earlier as a company that you focus on compliance, the easiest. Like
Yep,
I recall, like at Booking, by the time this came out, they were like in their 20th year, more or less, and then having to look at your entire stack for over decades to
yep,
ensure compliance was a massive task. And Booking did make sure that they became compliant. But I think now that companies already know that this exists, you can start to kind of build the process with the end in mind, knowing like, hey, I'm building this really cool, company, but I know these are some of the legislations in the space that I'm playing with. So I do think implementing GDPR has become a little easier because we understand what it is and we understand what is required. I think it'll be interesting to see as companies, as the world is actually changing, because even legislation on subscription management is changing, like in Germany. That's
yep,
one country. You can expect Europe to follow, and all of a sudden you need to adjust your entire tech stack to like be able to do that one thing. So I think
yep.
the new legislation that is changing in the industry is more of a stretch today than GDPR compliance is. If that makes sense.
It does. It absolutely does. I want to. You touched on something. It's essentially like getting into what the process is to go back. Like if you're booking, it's 20 years of records to go back and make sure they're compliant. Can you just enlighten me on what that process looks like regardless of what the legislation is, like we need to go back and we need to essentially audit ourselves and we need to figure out whether or not we are compliant and what we need to do to fix it. Like, what are you looking for when you do that backtracking, and what are some of the common areas that you would need to fix, whether the example is GDPR or some sort of subscription legislation that is more applicable, I guess, to an example?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and maybe it is because I'm in finance, that I find that a lot of startup scale ups forget at the beginning is to think indeed like follow the money. What is my process going to look like? And not capturing this correctly with data makes the implementation of legislation this much challenging, way more challenging. And I think so getting those foundations in place is critical. However, Joe, I think you asked the question as well. What is the tipping point? Like, when are
Yeah.
you going to do these things? So I think that's the question that we always have to answer it. Because like even as a finance leader, there are things that I want in a specific way and I want it to be neat. But this is how you're out the gate. This is as good as it's gonna get, and
Yeah.
don't let perfect be the enemy of getting things done, but how to make sure that you're still compliant. So I think those two things have to be in balance and to make sure that you are hitting the compliance checks and just like not lowering the quality on compliance, but still being able to go back and fix indeed like where you're seeing that needs to be fixed. Often how this has been approached or how I've done this in the past and currently as well is that I'll
Mm.
work very closely with a product and engineering team. Like I know what needs to get done. I don't know how to technically do stuff and they do. And so then we kind of have that conversation and I think one of the more fun conversation is always when I talk to my engineering team and we're talking about taxes. I'm like, you need to remember because an engineer is very logical. And I'm like, you need to remember tax is not logical. Like there's no amount of logic that you can apply that will be correct. It's like you need to follow the unlogical path that the government wants you to apply this. And so that's like it kind of breaks the tension of like, arguing into how it should be done because it doesn't make sense. Where we start
Yep.
out the gate saying it's not going to make sense. We just got to make it work the way the government wants to work. And I think it's the same thing in when you want to implement some legislation or corrections in your stack. We'll partner with the engineering team or in the product team and be like, hey, this is what needs to get done. As a finance leader, this needs to be the end result. I'm not exactly sure how to get there. What are our options? And then, they'll start their scrum session, they'll start discussing what's the best approach. They'll come up with some designs. In some cases, like the GDPR, you can actually run scripts, like to make
Mm.
sure that you're like fishing your entire database to make sure Joe has been removed out of everything, even if it's
Yep.
20,000 years old. Like these are kind of searches that you can kind of set up from the engineering side. And I think that's why it's so powerful to team up with your engineering team or even as a finance professional, like, make those connections because you can do so much more together than you can do if you're working individually in your corners. And I think the collaboration is one of the most advantageous for any industry. Like, don't chuck your finance folks in the back of the company, like put them together with your engineering guys. Like, it's a lot safer that way.
Oh my God. It's so funny because I know I don't know if you listen to a backlog of episodes, but like that was the impetus for this entire show. It's what we believe as a company at Mosaic is that finance has traditionally been tossed in the back. They are the back office function. Nobody thinks about them, and that is not great. You are better when finance is that strategic partner. They are in front. They are collaborating with every piece of the business. I love that. Anytime, honestly, I think every episode we've done, somebody has brought that up unprompted. It's always like, there's a question I'll ask at the end to ask everybody about like something you wish you knew. And it's never about like, I wish I knew this Excel function to be a better modeler when I was like in my early career. It's always like, how do I build better processes around collaborating with my team? So I really love the engineering example. It's not a common one. I hear a lot about collaborating with sales, collaborating with CS, and collaborating with product and engineering comes up, but it's less there are fewer like real world examples. So I really love
Yeah.
they jumped into that.
Well,
It's really
to
great.
be fair, Paddle is like end-to-end platform compliance and taxes. So they kind of, the
Hand in
collaboration
hand.
tends to be a little bit more organic there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I wanna get into tech stack, and obviously this fits right into Paddle's alley. So we can talk about Paddle for sure. But I want to talk about the broader tech stack as well, because you're not just doing compliance, like that's what Paddle does, but you need to build the entire finance tech stack. So,
Yeah.
we've talked about kind of being that one man show or one woman show and trying to build all this out. You need tech to support the processes that you're doing. So, can you talk a little bit about what a company should look for in a solution to help them with all of the pain points that you've discussed so far? And we'll focus on the subscription legislation and kind of billing processes for now. We'll get into the broader tech stack in a minute.
Yeah, I think something that's super interesting because obviously, all SaaS companies, including us, including Paddle, we do have salespeople. When looking for finance tooling, I always recommend to get like a customer reference. So I like the sales team will always promise you everything and everything's perfect. But I find like getting like to talk to a customer or like to talk to peer in industries and getting the word of mouth recommendations are so much more valuable. So that would definitely be one of my top recommendations. Like I found, like I remember we were implementing like an AP invoice scanning automation tool at this one company I was working at. And the salesperson's like, oh, I can automate 100%. And it has like machine learning in the background. And I'm like, and I'm looking at the pricing and I know what machine learning is. I'm just like, something doesn't add up. So I spoke to a customer of theirs and he's just like, oh, you'll be lucky if you had 80%. And that's on a good day. And then he's just like,
Oh
machine
no.
learning, there is no machine learning. You are the machine learning. You have to key in what it needs to learn, you know? And so I think talking to a good customer gives you like a realistic impression of what you're actually trying to buy into, which is so critical. A
Yep.
salesperson will always say yes to everything, but a customer will tell you what the reality is. It's like, and so I often take the ground in the middle and be like, all right, that's what I'll base my decision on whether I acquire a tool or not. And I think for us, I think we're often looking in the tax space because
Mm.
we are tax experts in our fields. And I think I'm super thankful and impressed and amazed at like how we do it here. And our team is just amazing and how we're set up in the space. But tax is continually changing. And I think one of the things that we're also looking at, because tax is our business, how do we scale tax instead of just like, because a lot of countries are still manual submissions, right? Some of them
Yep.
literally you have to like still fill in manually the form. So, you know, like how do we scale this? And so I think that's been interesting to really look at our taxes, like where do we actually need the human element and where can we like automate some of these processes? So, but again, I think as it's quite early and I think everybody, all of us are trying to like see like how can we insulate this risk and make sure that we're compliant everywhere. And there's still a lot of tools, but also a lot of
Yep.
people that need to revise and review what's happening. So I think that's been an interesting space to kind of invest in as well and grow.
How does Paddle think about like the idea of flexibility? So like you're talking about how things change so often, like we're trying to scale, but it's really easy to scale something when it's the same. Like we had an episode once, it was about basically like automating the month end close and like different accounting functions. It's like the rule of automation was it's something that is repetitive and it's like the same day in, day out. And like that's the hallmark of automating anything.
Right.
And so a tax, like to your point, you can't do that. So how do you, as a software company like Paddle that handles this, how do you think about being flexible enough in the product so you can handle these like changes as they come up? Like how does that work for you in the finance department?
I kind of mentioned it already. It's kind of like starting with the end in mind.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think having been in larger tech companies and seeing their growth pains, I think a lot of companies start out like, oh, we'll build an in-house invoicing tooling. And then to your point, like it's very usually very simple because most companies that do this is one product, one
yep,
tax line item, one market. And then, you know, as you continue to grow, like you're saying, the complexities to have your own billing tool in house and sustain these tax changes is virtually impossible. Like
yeah,
I've literally seen entire billing teams hired for like one country because of the tax complexities around it. And so, you know, and then if it's so deeply embedded in your stack, it becomes very difficult to keep it flexible. So now as
yep,
well, and I think this comes back to having engineering and finance work closely together. Whenever a panel even conceives of starting to like build a specific invoicing around anything, we start with what does it need to be able to do in the end? And the
yep,
biggest ask is then the flexibility of the tax fields. Like we should be able to have, and it sounds really extreme, but we should be able to have at least five flexible and tax items. And these
yep,
five items should be able to interact with different line items if needed. And then how do they interact with each other? So some of them are aggregated, some of them are independent. So we need to create the flexibility because you don't know what the government's going to do next. And
yep,
so, you know, you kind of run through all the scenarios. So you kind of build today with the end in mind of like whatever request comes. And even so, they'll manage to surprise you. I mean, that's just the nature of the game, right? But
yep.
but I think that's the best you can do as a good business leader to think about, hey, today I'm selling, you know, this one thing. What are the possible other things that I might go into that I have zero interest to do? But if you start thinking about making your product agnostic enough, you could be scaling some of these sales and
Yep.
taxes and things that you're dealing with.
I love that idea of it's just so it's applicable to everything outside of, you know, this compliance legislation kind of idea we're talking about. So, you know, as a finance leader, like it's great to get your insight from the Paddle side about how you all handle this, but I'm curious, like, what your broader thoughts are on the finance tech stack. Like, when you pick this idea up and you say, like, we have to start with the end in mind, we have to build our tech stack for, you know, some months, years down the road. I don't know. What are some recent like investments you've made in Paddle's finance tech stack that have kind of fallen into the same idea of maintaining flexibility, thinking of the future, the end in mind?
So like that we've built in-house or that we've
Anything. It could
brought in.
be a new, I don't know, point solution that you put in place to automate a task that, is going to help you guys scale even further, or
Yeah,
honestly anything. Just curious about
yeah.
how you think about your own finance
Yeah,
tech
I'll
stack.
share a little bit about our invoicing because I think one of our product directors, also Lucas, has had a few conversations on these things, and it's been
Nice.
super great to partner with them. And just thinking like when we started this process, I think both of us kind of walked in with something already kind of brewing, and then we started connecting on things. And then, his question as well was like, "Well, what do you need from a finance side?" I was like, "Well, from a finance side, I need to know it doesn't exist."
Yep.
And what I mean with that is it just needs to be able to run. And what is the end cycle of an invoice is actual payments, right? And so we were just like, him and I were connecting. He's like, well, this is the MVP. This is the minimal viable product. What does it need to be able to do? I was like, it needs to be able to automate any form of bank payments that come in or, payment providers that come in. And so the way we were working about this is it's like, all right, so then it actually should be able to like change bank accounts on the invoices. So it should be able to have a virtual bank account that we could like uniquely identify to each payment or customer so that there doesn't have to be like 20,000 accountants assigning cash. Like there's more meaningful things to do with your life. Like
Yep.
what does that reconciliation to payment look like? And so we've like really worked together to say, well, today it does this. These are the basic requirements it needs to be able to tie to the payment. So be it bank, be it a check, we were joking about cash. We don't take cash, or like be it through a payment provider that it needs to be automatically be able to close the invoice and float. And so I think those are some good examples to begin with the end in mind to say,
Yep.
well, you could just build a document that sits on your stack deck and you send it out there to space and accounting can go figure out, whoever paid that invoice. And it's especially great if you have subscriptions that are the same amount in the whole world. That person's gonna be looking for days. And so, like, just having those unique identifiers, it will really help your accounting team scale and actually be able to use their brain and intelligence to do more productive things. So I think that's a good collaboration that you'll have between like products being willing also to say like, hey, what do you guys need? Or how should this work? So I think that those are good examples of scaling together.
That's awesome. It must be so cool to work at a company that sells some kind of finance tool as a finance person. Because I'm guessing, like when you were in hospitality, like you don't get to really impact the end product as like a finance person or someone like cleaning up the books. So no, it just sounds really great that you're able to collaborate with all these people and bring kind of your insight and help Paddle's end customers as well, because like they're dealing with the same problems you are. And so, yeah, just seems really cool.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
Paddle is pretty cool. Honestly, as a like they didn't pay me to say this, but they really are.
I mean, I believe it. Well, actually, that leads me to another question. It's more broadly about kind of where finance tech may be trending. I checked out the website because we were going to be chatting, and I was like, "Oh, this is a really cool website." And then I stumbled across the news that y'all acquired Profitwell, and Profitwell, at least for my business, they're really good at content, and I do content, and so I know all about Profitwell. So to me, and correct me if I'm wrong because I don't have the full context, it seems like acquiring a company like Profitwell expands like Paddle's product footprint like immensely. Like you just,
Yes.
instead of covering just like the billing piece, you cover kind of end to end, just like subscription analytics management, things like that. And so we did an article one time, I think it was with Ron Gill, who's the former CFO of NetSuite. And he was like talking about these waves that he's seen of finance tech, like bundling and like unbundling, and like at a time where like everything was supposed to be like in an ERP. And then everyone was like, well, that's not working. We'll break it apart. And then it was like, oh, like now we have all these SaaS tools and they're just all over the place. And so bringing together like Paddle and Profitwell, it feels like it's more like this trend that we should be bringing things more together than we should be like doing point solutions for everything. I'm curious how you think about finance tech. Like, is it something that should be like an all-in-one kind of thing, or are you good with point solutions? I'm curious, like, what the philosophy is there from a finance tech perspective.
Yeah. So obviously Paddle is an end-to-end solve all kind of, and that was also the aspiration wherewith we started. And
Yep.
that's also what I love about Paddle, because it's a mission that I can really connect with. Like so many software
Love it.
designers, like you said, excited to go out into the world, and everybody's like, legislation cramping your style because you can't do anything. And that's what I love about our CEOs, like vision, mission, saying like, oh no, we want to enable them to go out there and do business, and we'll take all the responsibility and all of the heavy lifting. So that really connects with me because it feels like I'm contributing to like bringing good software, even though I can't build software to save my life. So yeah, so I think Paddle has done like a really great job as a company to say, we'll do your invoicing, we'll do your payments, we'll do your compliance, we'll do your taxes, we'll even manage your chargebacks. Like they'll take the whole burden off of the company to be able to do that. And I
Yep.
think to your point of saying like, hey, now we have profit well. So it's like Paddle on steroids now. It's like we're not only gonna do it for you, but we're gonna provide all these insights and analytics and like be able to help you manage your churn and so on. And so we already have
Yep.
some of the testing products to like to some of our customers to be like, hey, go play with this and see what you think. And then based on that feedback, make it better. In terms of a finance professional, I agree to yes, there are trends. There's like bundling, unbundling, bundling, unbundling. And I think in some instances as a business, I do think there's room for both. And
Sure.
why am I saying that is because it does depend on where you're at as a company and where you want to get to. In some instances, you may just need a payment provider. In my humble opinion, if you're gonna go out and get an invoicing company, just drop your
Yeah.
search and like then start bundling, because you can get Paddle for way more cost effective to do everything for you versus going out and getting a billing engine. So I
Sure.
think it depends on what your business is looking for. And also, like you're saying, at what point do you go out and get tax advisor? So if you're gonna have to get an invoicing company, a payment provider, a tax advisor, someone to do your chargeback, someone to monitor your fraud, then it makes sense to go with like Paddle, who will do all of it for you. They'll
Yep.
assume all of the risk. But if you're a company, you're kind of chugging along and you have like your ERP, as you're saying, you can put in some easy add-ons and you can chug further. But it depends where you're going, what your intention is, what market you're going into. That I do think
Right.
as a business, there's room for both. And you
Yeah.
just have to look at what is a better match for you. But if you're going to indeed start taking billing separate, payment separate, tax separate, your fraud analyst separate, and stop, just go to Paddle.
Moral of the story, just go to
Yeah,
Paddle for
for
all
everything.
of your needs. We feel very much the same way. We talk about kind of like, and just in general with the tech stack, it's like being really intentional about the data architecture that you're creating and like the tech stack that you're building, so that you're not just looking at it, I don't know, 8 months later and you look back and you're like, I just put all these tools in, none of them talk to each other, none of them work together. All we have, I don't know, we need the engineering team to come in and manage all like the data analysis for it because like the finance team doesn't have that expertise. So um yeah, I think completely on brand with what we believe, with what every other guest has said as well, is just the more intentional you can be about matching these things to what your company does and what your company needs, like the better off you're going to be, whether that's Paddle, whether that's starting elsewhere and, building up to Paddle, like whatever it has to be. So love that. I know, I think at the beginning of this told you we were going to go for like 35 minutes and I'm way over that. So I will roll into the last question that I have, which I ask everybody, and it's really broad. So I appreciate everybody bearing with me when I ask it, but curious, what is one thing you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your career? I usually say finance career, but you were in hospitality. You've moved around. So curious what you wish you knew at the time.
Yeah, I think I went to college. I don't know if this is going to make me sound really, really old, but I went to college when this whole big boom just started happening. And I
Yeah.
think looking back at myself being in finance today, I wish I had spent more time learning more about tech and codes
Mm.
before continuing into finance. So I think the two of them go really well together. And now I have a 15-year-old, and that's exactly my advice to him. So he's like doing algebra and all these science things. And I'm like, but take the coding class too, like it doesn't mean, you'll go into tech space, but I think it's so fundamental and critical right now to make sure that or at least understand the logic and how it works. So I've been
Yep.
fortunate enough that again, product and engineering, everywhere I've worked from like booking to message board to Paddle, they have been extremely patient to teach me. So like I'll ask the questions and they're like, how do you not notice? I was like, not engineering. I don't understand. And so like, so they've taught me enough that we're able to sit and we understand each other. But there's still some points like when we talk about like ROI or like, why are we doing this? That
Yep.
there's a bit of a language barrier. But again, I think the product and engineering teams are fantastic. The culture there is great. And it is about teaching and sharing. So that's helped me
Yeah.
scale my own knowledge to be able to function in that space a little bit as well as a finance professional.
I feel exactly the same way. I also have no bad. I was like an English major. I read books and I write. Like I don't know code, and I wish, not that I want to go be an engineer, but there are even like certain pieces of software, like even like WordPress. It's like I want to change some font in like the CMS, and it's like if I knew HTML or like some kind of code, like I could probably do it really quickly. And instead, I'm like, what does, I don't know, the editor allow me to do? And so I totally on board with the idea of just like at least understanding the language, being able to poke around and kind of be curious about that. I love it. I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, like I just wanted to say thanks so much for joining. It's been a really great conversation. I've learned a lot. I think you've managed to make billing and tax compliance an interesting 40-minute conversation, which is amazing. So impressive for you. But as we roll to the end, I just want to say thank you and give you a chance to plug Paddle. Where can people find out more about what you all do? Where can people connect with you and get to know you a little bit more?
Oh, thank you, Joe. Paddle is a paddle.com. So that's an easy find. And myself, I'm on LinkedIn as well. And I do really enjoy helping and advising and anywhere I can. Because I think especially in the beginning, earlier in your career, you had to figure out everything yourself out and then figure out how things run. And I think the culture across all businesses are a lot more open. So definitely if I can be of help or service, happy to do so.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate you spending time with us. Hope maybe we can do it again sometime, but it was great to have you on the Roll Forward today.
Sure. It was great meeting you, Joe.
All right,
Take
bye,
care.
Danille.
Bye.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, the strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.